Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. The letter was folded so carefully it could have been mistaken for something precious. Chief Petty Officer Daniel "Danny" Mercer sat alone at the kitchen table of a house that no longer felt like home, holding a single page in his weathered hands. Outside, the Virginia afternoon was bright and ordinary. Children played in neighboring yards. A mail truck passed slowly down the street. Life continued as if nothing had changed. Inside, everything had already ended. Elizabeth's handwriting was steady. She had always been steady, stronger than he deserved, more patient than the years had earned. Danny could picture her sitting at this same table, choosing each word with the same care she had given their marriage. 22 years of loving a man who kept disappearing even when he was standing right in front of her. I can't keep loving someone who is always somewhere else, even when he's home. Danny read it twice, then a third time, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too well. 20 years in the Navy SEALs had taught him to survive impossible things. Underwater demolitions in freezing waters, hostage extractions under enemy fire, months deployed in places that didn't exist on any official map. He had learned to compartmentalize pain, to function on no sleep, to make decisions when every option led through darkness. But it had never taught him how to stay, how to be present when his mind was still scanning rooftops for threats, how to sleep beside someone without jolting awake at every sound, how to answer the simple question, "How was your day?" when most of his days were classified and the ones that weren't were too heavy to share. He had tried. God knows Elizabeth had tried harder. But some wars don't end when you come home. Some battles are fought in the silence between words, in the space across a dinner table, in the slow and quiet realization that love, no matter how strong, cannot reach someone who has locked themselves away. He folded the letter back along its original creases and set it on the table beside his dog tags. Some losses didn't need words. There had been no argument, no shouting, no accusations thrown like grenades. Elizabeth had simply loved him as long as she could, and then, gently, with a dignity that broke his heart more than anger ever could, she had let go. Danny didn't blame her. He blamed the man he had become. At 41 years old, he carried the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime bracing against impact, broad shoulders that had carried wounded brothers, hands that had held weapons, pulled men from water, written letters to families he would never meet. A face marked not by age, but by memory, lines carved by sun, salt, and the weight of things he could never unsee. His eyes, once sharp with command, able to assess a threat in seconds, now held a distant calm, the kind that comes from seeing too much and saying too little. He had retired 3 weeks earlier without ceremony. No speeches, no party, just a final handshake, a salute that felt like surrender, and a plaque that would gather dust in a box somewhere. The silence that followed had been deafening. And then, on a gray Thursday morning, a legal notice arrived in the mail. His grandmother, Margaret Hale Mercer, had passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 87. According to the attorney's letter, she had left him everything, which meant a small piece of land on an isolated island in Lake Superior, far north near the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, miles from the nearest town. Danny hadn't seen his grandmother in over a decade. She had been a woman of few words, unshakable faith, and a quiet strength that needed no explanation. She had lost her husband to Korea, raised 2 sons alone, and lived the last 20 years of her life in a place most people couldn't find on a map.
She had once told him, when he was young and restless and eager to prove himself, "God doesn't always call the equipped, Danny. Sometimes He equips the called. And sometimes He just puts you exactly where you need to be, whether you understand it or not." He hadn't understood then. He still didn't, but he had nowhere else to go. Danny didn't go to the island to heal. He went there to disappear. He packed one worn duffel bag, a few changes of clothes, thermal gear, his grandfather's old compass, the brass worn smooth by decades of use, a Bible his grandmother had given him when he enlisted, still wrapped in its original ribbon, pages unread. And he brought one companion, Bear, a 6-year-old German shepherd with dark, intelligent eyes and a coat the color of charcoal and rust. Bear had served beside Danny for 4 years, maritime security patrols, counter-narcotics operations, classified missions in waters where one mistake meant death. He was a Navy working dog, trained to detect explosives, to move without sound, to stay calm when chaos erupted around him.
Bear had saved Danny's life twice. Once in the Persian Gulf, alerting to a device before Danny's team walked into an ambush. Once in the North Atlantic, when Danny went overboard during a storm and Bear refused to leave the rail, barking until the crew found him in the black, frozen water. When Bear retired due to a minor hip injury, Danny had adopted him without hesitation. Where Danny withdrew from the world, Bear watched it. Where Danny had forgotten how to trust, Bear still knew how. The drive north took 2 days. The roads grew narrower, the towns smaller, the forests thicker. Eventually, there were no towns at all, just endless pine, granite cliffs, and the vast, cold presence of Lake Superior stretching toward the horizon like something eternal and indifferent. A local fisherman named Emil, weathered as driftwood and twice as quiet, agreed to take them across by boat. The water was already beginning to freeze. Sheets of ice floated like broken glass. The hull cracked through them with sounds that felt too loud, too final. "Storm's comin'," Emil said, his voice rough from decades of wind. "You sure about this?" Danny nodded. Emil studied him for a long moment, the kind of look one veteran gives another. Then he nodded back and said nothing more. The island appeared through the mist like a memory half forgotten. Small, tree-covered, silent. The cabin stood near the eastern shore, a sturdy structure of weathered wood and stone, flanked by towering pines that had stood for 100 years. Firewood was stacked neatly beneath a canvas tarp. The windows were sealed tight. The porch was swept clean of snow. It looked too well kept for a place that had been empty for months, too ready, too waiting. Bear was the first to step onto the dock. The moment his paws hit the wood, he froze. His ears lifted, his body went rigid. He stared toward the eastern tree line, not with fear, but with focus. This was a dog who had walked through gunfire without flinching. If he was listening, there was a reason. Danny carried their supplies inside. The cabin was cold but clean. A wood stove sat in the corner, cast iron and ancient. A small kitchen with a hand pump for water. A single bedroom with a bed frame and a mattress that smelled faintly of cedar. Everything simple, everything necessary, nothing wasted. On the mantel above the stove, there was a framed photograph of his grandmother, Margaret, standing on this very porch, her silver hair pulled back in a bun, her hands resting on the railing, her expression calm and certain. She looked like a woman who knew exactly why she was there. Danny set down his bag and sat heavily in the old wooden chair by the window. For the first time in months, maybe years, he let himself feel the weight of it all. The missions that had taken pieces of him he would never get back. The marriage that had slipped through his fingers like water. The brothers he had lost.
whose names were carved into a wall he couldn't bear to visit, the man he used to be, and the hollow shape he had become. Bear padded over silently and rested his head on Danny's knee. Danny's hand moved automatically to the dog's fur, fingers threading through the thick coat, feeling the warmth and the steady rise and fall of breath. "Just you and me now, boy," he whispered. Bear's dark eyes didn't leave his face, and for the first time in a long time, Danny didn't feel completely alone. That night, Danny couldn't sleep. The wind moved across the frozen lake in strange patterns, sliding over the ice and through the trees with a sound that felt almost intentional. It didn't howl, it whispered, it circled. Bear lay by the door, eyes open, ears twitching at sounds Danny couldn't hear. Danny rose and lit a lantern, the cabin filled with warm, flickering light. In the corner, beneath a loose floorboard marked with a small carved cross, he found a tin box. Inside was a leather-bound notebook. His grandmother's handwriting filled every page, small, precise, deliberate, each entry dated, each one numbered. It wasn't a journal, it was a record. November 14th, 1998. Ice shelf unstable near North Point, marked with stones and red cloth. December 2nd, 1999. Hiker lost near Western Ridge, found him using sound reflection. Wind from the east distorts distance. January 9th, 2001. Boy, age 7, wandered from hunting camp, hypothermic, brought him in. Parents arrived by morning. March 17th, 2003. Snowmobiler broke through the ice, heard him calling, pulled him out. He never knew my name. Page after page, year after year, lives saved in careful, humble script. And then underlined 3 times in thick pencil. When the wind comes from the east, sound will lie. Trust your eyes, trust your heart, trust God's prompting more than either. Danny's pulse quickened.
His chest tightened. His grandmother hadn't lived here to escape people. She had lived here to save them. This cabin, this island, it wasn't a refuge. It was a post, a place of service, and she had kept it for 20 years. The storm arrived on the 5th night. It came without warning, the way the worst things always do. The sky turned the color of iron. The wind howled across the lake with a fury that shook the cabin walls and rattled the windows in their frames. Snow fell so thick the world disappeared within minutes. Danny bolted the door and fed the stove, but Bear began to pace, back and forth across the room, a low growl building in his throat. Danny had seen this before, on night missions, when Bear sensed movement human instincts couldn't detect, when danger was close but invisible. "What is it, boy?" Bear went to the door and scratched, urgent and insistent. Danny's training kicked in. He pulled on his heavy coat, laced his boots, grabbed a flashlight and rope. He opened the door, and the cold hit him like a physical blow. The wind tried to rip the door from his hand. Bear didn't wait. He launched into the storm with purpose, his dark shape barely visible against the whiteout. Danny followed. The snow was blinding, the cold burned his lungs, but Bear moved with certainty, avoiding drifts that looked solid but weren't, stopping at patches of ice hidden beneath fresh snow. This was a dog trained for search and rescue, every instinct honed, every movement intentional. And then Bear stopped, cocked his head, listened, then turned sharply east toward the forest and ran. Danny remembered his grandmother's words, "When the wind comes from the east, sound will lie." He followed Bear into the trees, branches clawing at his face, snow soaking through his gloves. His breath came hard, his legs burned. And then Bear barked. Not a warning,
A call. Danny pushed through the underbrush and found him. A boy, maybe 9 years old, small for his age, curled beneath a fallen spruce tree. His jacket was too thin. His lips were blue. His whole body trembled violently, uncontrollably. His eyes were half closed, glazed with the dangerous sleep that comes before the end. Danny's SEAL training snapped into place like muscle memory. He dropped to his knees, checked the boy's pulse, faint, irregular, but there. He pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around the small, shaking frame. Bear immediately pressed his body against the boy, sharing warmth without hesitation or command. "Stay with me," Danny said firmly, his voice cutting through the wind. "You're going to be okay. I've got you. Do you hear me? I've got you." The boy's eyes fluttered open, confused, terrified. "It's okay," Danny said, softer now, the voice he used to use with his own nephews. "You're safe now. What's your name?" Ethan, the boy whispered through chattering teeth. "Ethan. Good. I'm Danny. This is Bear. We're going to get you warm. Can you hold on to me?" The boy nodded weakly. Danny lifted him carefully, cradling him against his chest. Bear stayed close, breaking trail through the storm, as if he could see a path written in the dark. The walk back felt endless. Danny's arms ached, his face was numb, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop. When they finally reached the cabin, Danny kicked the door open and carried Ethan inside. He worked through the night with steady hands, warm blankets, hot water bottles wrapped in towels, a fire roaring in the stove. He checked the boy's pulse every 15 minutes, monitored his breathing, talked to him softly, keeping him awake, keeping him present. Bear never left Ethan's side, lying beside him like a guardian. And somewhere in those long, quiet hours, watching a child's color slowly return, hearing his breathing steady, feeling life win against the cold, Danny felt something shift deep inside him. A purpose he thought he'd lost, a reason he thought had died. By morning, the storm had passed. The world was white and still and impossibly beautiful. Ethan's parents arrived with the search and rescue team, his mother collapsing beside him, sobbing with relief. His father unable to speak, just holding his son and shaking. "Thank you," Ethan's mother whispered, gripping Danny's hand. "Thank you, thank you." Danny could only nod, his throat too tight for words. After the helicopter left, one man stayed behind. Walter Grayson, retired park ranger, 68 years old, gray beard, eyes that had seen too many winters and too many close calls. "You're Margaret's grandson," Walt said quietly. "I am." Walt looked around the cabin slowly, taking it all in. Then he looked back at Danny. "She saved my nephew," Walt said. 15 years ago. He was 17, drunk, stupid, got lost in a blizzard. She found him, didn't lecture him, just gave him soup and sent him home." He paused. "She never told anyone what she did here, but we knew. The Rangers knew. The locals knew. For 20 years, Margaret kept this light on. She saved more lives than anyone will ever count." Danny's chest ached. "She didn't do it for thanks," Walt continued. "She did it because she believed God put her here, that this was her calling. And when people asked why she stayed in such a lonely place, she'd say, 'It's only lonely if no one needs you.'" Danny stared out at the frozen lake, the endless white, the silence. "This place was never abandoned," Walt said quietly. "It was waiting for someone to keep the watch." He put a hand on Danny's shoulder. "You chose well." That night, Danny stood on the porch as the sun set over the ice. The sky burned orange and pink and gold. Bear sat beside him, calm and watchful as always. Danny reached up and turned on the porch light, and he left it on. Word spread slowly, the way it does in small northern towns where people still talk to each other and remember names. If you're lost, look for the light on Mercer Island. If you can't find your way, follow the dog. If the door is open, you're safe. They came, one by one. A hiker who misjudged the daylight. A snowmobiler who broke through thin ice and walked for miles, shaking and scared.
A truck driver who slid off a distant road and wandered into the trees, sure he was going to die. Bear found them first every time, calm, steady, leading them home. Danny didn't talk much. He didn't need to. He offered what his grandmother had offered: warmth, food, safety, presence. No judgment, no questions, just a place to breathe. And slowly, quietly, he began to understand. God hadn't brought him here to disappear. He had brought him here to serve. Not with guns or missions or strategies, but with an open door and a light that never went out. Spring came slowly to the north. The ice cracked and groaned and finally let go. The world turned green. Birds returned. Life began again. Danny stayed. He repaired the dock, cleared trails, learned the island the way his grandmother had. Every rock, every shift in the wind, every sound that didn't belong. Some nights when the weight of the past pressed down, memories of missions gone wrong, of friends who didn't come home, of a marriage he couldn't save, Bear would lean against his leg. A silent reminder: you are here. You are needed. You are not alone. Danny would close his eyes and feel the warmth of the dog beside him, and he would remember his grandmother's words. God doesn't always call the equipped. Sometimes he just puts you where you need to be. The cabin still stands. The light still burns. And somewhere out there, someone will lose their way again. When they do, there will be a loyal dog who senses it first. A man who thought his life was over, but found it was just beginning. And a light waiting in the dark. Sometimes God doesn't remove the storm. Sometimes he places a servant inside it. This is a story for those who have served and wondered if it mattered. For those who have lost and wondered if they could be found. For those who feel broken and wonder if they can still be used. You can. Your life still has purpose. And sometimes the greatest act of faith is simply staying and keeping the light on for someone else. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that even broken things can still serve a beautiful purpose, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Tell us if you've ever felt lost but found your way home. And if stories like this bring you comfort, hope, and remind you that God is always working even in the quiet places, please subscribe to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. Together, we'll keep the light on. God bless you, friend, and thank you for being here.